On behalf of Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, I would like to welcome you to this specific webinar, which couldn't be more timely: Rights, Wrongs, and Distortions, Examining Human Rights Stance on Israel. I would say that for Jews, the world before October 7th and the world after October 7th is much, much different, significantly different from different angles and points of views. The trauma of October 7th was experienced differently by Israelis and by Jews abroad, but I think it would be safe to say that both of the communities in Israel and outside of Israel have paid and are paying a very heavy price on a personal level and on a communal level. I would assume that most of us feel alone, betrayed, abandoned. There's a big dissonance, huge dissonance between what we thought our stand and position in the world was and what we feel right now when we see what's happening and the response of many of our friends, mainly our friends. I think Jews don't really understand how we have reached this point in history, which we have to fight again for who we are and what we believe in, and the right to exist and the right to be, feel safe everywhere. And one would assume that after something horrific, like the terror act on October 7, the worst thing that happened to Jews ever since the Holocaust, one would assume that people would have sympathy and empathy and understanding. One would even hope that there might be some recognition to what's happening in Israel and the complexity of the situation here in Israel and with our neighbors in the Middle East. And some would even might expect that people will understand what I call the new axis of evil, which is the Red-Green Alliance in the West, that there will be some recognition that this axis has become very, very evil and very dangerous. But I think we have been proven wrong. Back in October 7, even before the full scope of the terror act was, shared with everyone, it's already been framed and glorified as an act of resistance to the oppressor against Israel. Even before Israel retaliated, we already were framed as the aggressor, and they were framed as the victims. So when it comes to the discourse of social justice and human rights, Jews and Israelis are never the victim, never the minority, never the marginalized. We are always be framed as the oppressors and the one to be attacked. In this toxic discourse, public discourse, which is fed by disinformation and misinformation and propaganda by Hamas and its proxies in the West. Some of them are useful idiots, some of them do believe what they say. The silence of the organization is frustrating. And I think that when we say that, we can assume that every one of us feel the same. Jews are feeling that they are left alone. And this is something we have not felt for a long time, that we are alone in the world, not isolated, but alone. This is a whole different type of feeling. This shallow discourse, which is oppressor versus oppressed, ignorant, binary, black and white, nothing else, no other colors, trendy, which means the intersectionality, that all those who feel marginalized should work together, never mind what they do, which is led by a political agenda, which is using human rights language and social justice terms to fight against what is right. And even an extreme event like happened on October 7 was framed in a way which puts us on the defense mode, because now we have to be, abiding some kind of historical justice based on some perceived colonialism that we have here in Israel. I think the main thing that we have to understand that in this discourse, everything the oppressed are doing is positive. This is the way it will be seen. Okay, never mind what they are doing, never mind what the atrocities were. If they are framed as the oppressed, then this is a positive thing. And the gap between facts and reality and the made-up story that people are telling themselves is something which is very hard to bridge. I have to say, and this might be sounding like a very tough generalization, But I feel that there is a whole generation which is lost, which has lost its moral compass, and we are losing it together. And I think that we shouldn't undermine what is really the discourse today is all about. This is a true peril to the Jewish people. What we are seeing today is what we call an imminent and clear danger to the Jewish national security around the world. The generation that consumes news and understands the world through the lenses of social networks, TikToks and other, they recite and hold anti-Semitic positions using the world of social justice and human rights, and they actually brought it to the level of some kind of new religion. And they are the disciples of this new religion, and they don't think twice before they go to action. And it's enough to just look for examples that you saw just lately. South Africa with the ICJ lawsuit. This is a reversal of things. We are the attacked ones, have to, justify why we are retaliating. And the attacker is being the one who's now perceived as going through a genocide. Human rights organization, from the UN to other organizations, which were silent through all the first few months of this war. And maybe the most frustrating is the silence of women organizations. Academia, the stronghold of liberalism, which in the name of freedom of speech, in the name of freedom of academia, in the name of progressivism, they call for genocide. And of course, the local level, people who don't know what they are talking about, issues claims and declaration and statements and things like that against Israel and in favor of Palestinians. So I think it's fair to say that Jews are always, now at least, will be perceived as privileged, an oppressor, never the victim, never marginalized. This is an unbelievable distortion, and this is why talking about these issues is very important. So in the name of COM, again, I'm welcoming this webinar. And Olga, the floor is yours. Olga from NGO Monitor.
Thank you, Sima, for your always profound and very deep comments and analysis of the situation. On this grim and not so optimistic note, I would like to introduce actually our panel today. You framed it so well, actually, and I can only add in one sentence that before October the 7th, much of the discourse discussed on whether anti-Zionism is also anti-Semitism, where is the line between the two, and how difficult is it to sometimes draw that line, when people or institutions or organizations criticize Israel and Israeli policies, where does that criticism cross the line into anti-Semitism? I think after October the 7th, everyone here in Israel and the Jewish community around the world. And, we call it the Jews globally, but it's important to say that actually not all Israelis are Jews. So there is also the sort of generalization of everyone who lives in Israel and almost dehumanization, right? Because we're all just representatives of the Jewish state, although not all victims of October the 7th were Jews, on the contrary, but they were all bundled up, sort of. And I think we all felt that regardless where each one of us finds him or herself vis-a-vis politically, right, vis-a-vis the conflict, the two-state solution, or on a political map, we are all being identified as one in not only the criticism towards Israel and the policies, but also the unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism that were unleashed. Anti-Semitism unseen in the recent years, because it didn't come only in verbal forms. It also came with horrific physical violence against the Jews. And our panel today actually is trying to deal with how all of us were left abandoned and betrayed within that broader human rights community or human rights space from different perspectives. We have the honor of having two survivors. We're actually a survivor and a relative of a survivor from the Nova Music Festival who will be able to give us the first-hand testimony of how, what they went through. And then we have with us experts from across the policy areas. We have the Pnina Sharvit Baruch, who is a seasoned IDF veteran and a senior researcher at the INSS, who will be giving us analysis from the legal perspective and what might come up and what we might be looking at in months and to come. We have Dr. Saralyn Mark with us, who will zoom in and dive in with us within one particular policy area, and that is, well, I dare say, and in this panel that is mainly women, probably the most horrific atrocity that happened on October the 7th, which is the gender-based violence, right? Then we have Danielle Haas, who is a former senior editor at the Human Rights Watch and a seasoned journalist who covered stories from a variety of conflict-ridden areas, not only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And last and definitely not least, Emily Schrader, who is a strategic digital media advisor and a seasoned social media activist and expert, who will be giving us a little bit more of an insight into that and probably the most violent of all spheres. So without further ado, I'll hand on the floor to Galit Lapidot Goren, whose niece, Tiferet, was brutally murdered at the Nova Music Festival. Galit, thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and impressions with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Tiferet was a very big personality, and we knew that. Do you know the song "You Are My Sunshine"? So she was our sunshine. She really, really was a big, very big, big personality. She was for me like a daughter. She was lovely, and she was so smart. And she came from an Orthodox family. Even though her family knew that she's going to travel in the world for 1 year and 7 months. It was not so easy, but we come for a very family that we speak about things, and they give her their blessing to like travel and volunteer in South Africa. So that's funny that she volunteered in South Africa with children with special needs. She never asked the children if they're Muslims or if they're Christians or if they're something else. She didn't care. People are people and children are children. And then she continued to travel with a lot of friends and love people. And then we knew how many souls she touched on her journey. And she came just to see, just to come to the season of the for Rosh Hashanah and to see the family because we missed her so much. She came just for 3 weeks, and she was planning to go back to Australia. She loved Australia and she wanted to go back to Australia. We're originally from Canada. Her father was born there, and my two brothers and my mother are Canadian. So is my grandmother, and she was also planning to go back to Canada to see where we grew up. Her family knew that she was going to the festival, and she arrived there about at 6:30. About 5:30 and 6:30, everything started as we know. Tiferet wanted to go inside the car, and she went inside to the car to like go back home with her friends. And then they started to like, they were in the car, and she said to the driver, "Stop, because I want to go with my friend, Rini. She's by herself in the car, and I'm going to Rini." So she went out of the vehicle and joined Rini. Ido, the man who drive the car, succeed and to like go out from the war zone to tell us. They shot at her and Rini. Then she ran with Rini to the bushes, called her mother. Her mother lost 22 years ago her brother. So Tiferet was very delicate for her to her and said that um, something's going wrong here. She didn't understand what's really was going wrong there. She thought it's something small, and she can see the police. And she asked her mother what to do, to continue to be in the bushes, or to go and join friends and behind the bar. And I'm thinking, as a mother, to get to this kind of a phone from your daughter, it's this kind of a nightmare, because you don't know what to say to your daughter. You don't understand what's going on there. She said that she loved her mother very much. She was very calm. And since then, we didn't hear from her. Her phone was, we thought it was in Gaza. And then for 10 days and 10 nights, we didn't know what's going on with it. You just can't, I think you can imagine what happened about 10 days and nights. We didn't know what to think about, and about Tiferet, especially at night. We couldn't go to sleep. We couldn't eat. We couldn't even go to bathe ourselves because we wanted to be with Tiferet. You know, and the thoughts, what they're doing for a beautiful girl, a young girl there. And we started to understand what happened there the same day, the Black Sabbath. So you can imagine we were, it was unbelievable hard. And after 10 days, we understood that they identified her body. We were crushed. As I told you, Tiferet was a very special girl. To the funeral arrived 2,000 people all around the world, all kinds of people, also from the Orthodox community and all the communities here in Israel and abroad, especially also from Australia and Sri Lanka and India. When I saw the body after 10 days, it was very difficult for me. And we did a weird thing. I like ran to the body and I hugged the body for the first time. And all of my family came and hugged her body. Because I knew her since she was born. I was there when she was born, I'm a doula. And I was there the day she was born. And I was there when I saw her body. And I hugged her. And I think I didn't feel her left leg. It was too much. I couldn't like bear the thought what they did to her. She was my daughter. She was my best friend. We all family were around her and couldn't leave her until they said that we have to take her and put her in the ground. It's unbearable to know. And 3 months later, it's very difficult because 3, 4 months now, I can understand that she's not here. And this vitalic, beautiful soul is not here with us. Somebody who really, and really don't know what happened to Tiferet. I, as her mother, as her aunt, her mother, her sisters, she has 6 brothers and sisters. We have to like fight every day with our imagination or what they did to her in her last hours. I have to like every day push my thoughts about what she saw and what she felt and what did they do to her and what did she feel in her last hours. And sometimes it's unbearable. I'm doing my best I can with the government of Canada to speak Tiferet's voice, to speak about the women victim, the psychological warfare, what they did to us, what they're trying to do to our minds as women. And I can tell you one thing, that we're not going to, our souls, we're not going to break. Her father, my brother, said that he will never break, his soul will never break. He's going to continue. And my mission is to speak for Tiferet and speak for women and also men who are victim, also a brutal victim of rape and murder. And we're here to speak their voices, novel voices.
Thank you. It's difficult to find words after you. We appreciate you sharing your thoughts and experience with us, and we salute you for being so brave. I think each one of us continues to feel that we were there at the music festival. And I think we're all still in collective trauma. And it's important to say that we still have over 130 hostages held in Gaza. So thank you for speaking up and for sharing your thoughts with us. And I apologize for my shivering voice, but I think I'm not alone. Today also with us is Alon Marek, who was also at the Nova Music Festival, but survived. Alon, thank you for joining us and for being ready to share with us what went on there, what you saw, and how you feel.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. So my name is Alon. I'm 24 years old. I'm from Haifa. And yes, I attended the Nova Festival with a friend of mine. So I'll start by speaking about my experience over there. And then I'd like to say a few more things. So I attended the festival with a friend of mine. His name is Omri. There we met with a big group of friends of him from the army. We arrived at about 2:30 a.m. and we actually had an amazing night. It was really an amazing festival full of beautiful people, and everybody was dancing and hugging each other, and really it was a really great experience, like a great rave. And at about 6:30 a.m., it all changed. The producers of the festival went on stage, and they turned off the music, and they asked us all to lay down on the floor because there were rockets being launched into Israel. It was enough just to look at the sky. You could see like tens of rockets being launched. So immediately everybody lay down on the ground. It took about 15-20 minutes until the organization understood that it won't stop anytime soon. So they asked everybody to pack all of their belongings and go back to the car and safely drive home. So I think it was not before 7 a.m. that people were starting to go out of the festival. So my friend and I, packing all of our belongings, our tents and everything, we entered the car. It was maybe 7:15 a.m. We started driving towards the exit of the festival, and immediately going out to the main road. You could either take right towards the south of Israel or take left towards the north of Israel. So us living in Haifa, we took left. And understandably, there was a big jam that was formed. And we were like hundreds of cars trying to escape what we thought was rockets. So everybody is driving really, really slow in a big jam. And at one point, we see all the cars in front of us going back to the south, going back towards the festival. And we couldn't understand why. So everybody in total panic, just escaping something, and us two in the car, not understanding what everybody is escaping. So from the situation that we were on the road with a line full of cars in front of us, we were in the situation that we were left alone on the road because everybody did a big U-turn and everybody in front of us escaped back to the south. Nobody said anything because I think nobody understood what really happened, but everybody was escaping something. They knew they were escaping something. So alone on the road, we look in front of us and we could see nothing except of a few cars that were on the side of the road. So we thought maybe it's the police or the militaries that they blocked the road because of a missile maybe had fallen. So we decided to start driving, and if the road is blocked, we will find a new way to go back home. So we started driving, and we actually entered a Hamas ambush. There were a few terrorists on the side of the road, and luckily, our luck was that in the same time, 3 police officers emerged to the scene, and there was a gunfight starting between the Hamas terrorists and the police officers. So immediately we took our head down and we drove as fast as we could. We could see on the side of the roads all the cars. The windows were shattered. There were blood on the road. I can only imagine. I didn't see it because we drove so fast, but I can only imagine that there were bodies also inside the cars. And really, so our luck was the 3 police officers that we saw them emerging at the same time, opening fire on the terrorist and taking all the attention from us, leaving us to escape. So yeah, this is the way we managed to escape. And I like to add, speaking of violation of human rights, we all know what happened, but again, I like to say that people going to a festival to dance and to enjoy, and then being chased into forests and being slaughtered, it's absurd. And people, civilians in their own house on a Saturday morning, on a holiday, being slaughtered, it's absurd. And people walking their dog out on a Saturday morning in the kibbutz or in Sderot or in the city and being slaughtered, it's absurd. And girls being raped, it's absurd, and then murdered. And all the scenes that we saw on Saturday morning, it's absolutely absurd. And if one day somebody wants to explain to his friend or to his parents or to his child what's human rights violation, it's enough to go back to Israel, to October 7th and to look at the events that happened. And I think it will be the best example for human rights violation. So yeah, I think that there's also a big thing. All of us, it us, like every person in Israel got hit by this attack. Either you've been there or you've experienced it, or somebody you know have experienced it, somebody you know was murdered or heavily injured, and we all know somebody, or we all know somebody. So there's a sentence from a song, I believe you all know, it's called The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel. And the first sentence of the song, it's, "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to speak with you. I've come to talk with you again." And since that day, like, there's nights I cannot even fall asleep because of the thoughts, because of the scenes. And the scenes I saw are very little, but still they are very strong. And it's hard to fall asleep, or maybe you're driving your car and suddenly you've got thoughts that are driving you crazy. And it's true for so many people in our country, in Israel. And I think it will be true for many years to come. So yeah, I think it's a sentence that's really relevant for our reality. And that's all I have to say. So yeah.
Alon, we are glad that you survived and that you are safe now, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. It's very difficult to listen to everything that that witnesses are sharing with us, but it's important to speak up and to keep sharing the stories, so that exactly what you say, the human rights violations that were perpetrated on October the 7th in Israel are not forgotten. I'd like to now open our panel, and I know it's difficult. It's very difficult for me to speak now, but it's nevertheless that important. Pnina, let's start with you. Only last week we counted, or we marked 100 days since the biggest attack, since October the 7th, what we refer to as the biggest attack on Jews since the Holocaust, right? And exactly at the same time, Israel had to defend itself at the International Court of Justice, where South Africa accused it of nonetheless but genocide. Now, to us, it seems completely insane, right? But can you, as a legal expert, right, can you please explain to us a bit more the context in which this happens, and the international legal ramifications of this trial?
Yes, well, it's very difficult, after hearing, on a personal note, I also know a few people that were there, and my electrician, his two daughters were murdered in the festival, and I'm constantly thinking, because I'm dealing also a lot with the gender-related violence, horrific crimes that were carried out, that I hope that they were killed quickly, and that they were not very tortured beforehand. So it's devastating, the situation. And then to top it all, South Africa applies to the International Court of Justice and alleges that Israel is violating its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the Genocide Convention. And it is requesting the court to grant urgent provisional measures to stop Israel from continuing its genocide in the Gaza Strip, and to stop the fighting, to stop Israel's IDF operations in the Gaza Strip. And just to remind us all that the driving force behind this convention was a Jew, a Polish Jew, Raphael Lemkin. And he developed this crime of genocide following his personal experience of an actual genocide, the efforts of the Nazis and their collaborators to exterminate the Jewish people. And of course, there is no genocide or attempted genocide carried out by Israel in Gaza. Actually, it is the deeds of Hamas. Some of them have been described and this rampage of these atrocities and murder of civilians in their homes, and butchering and torturing children and elderly and women and men. And these deeds were accompanied by these clear statements of the Hamas of intent to bring about the destruction of Israel. So these deeds and these statements actually fulfill the definition of genocide. Israel, on the other hand, is under a threat. And this is important to understand. The threat that Israel is facing amounts to an existential threat, because it is not only the Hamas, which itself has shown itself to be a very powerful and dangerous enemy, but Israel is facing a wider campaign orchestrated by an Iran-led axis, which includes terror organizations such as Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen and other Shia proxies of Iran, and they are attacking Israel on all fronts. All of them with this openly stated common purpose of destroying, annihilating the Jewish state. And beyond the military campaign, there is also, and Sima mentioned it, the diplomatic campaign. And this is also aimed actually at the destruction of the state of Israel by destroying Israel's right to exist. And the attempt to harness the Genocide Convention against Israel reflects part of this campaign and this growing phenomena of undermining the right of Israel and of the Jewish people of Israel to exist, and of the Jewish people to have a state of their own. Through accusations, and the way is by making accusations comparing Israel with the Nazi regime. In practice, this is intended to deny Israel the right to defend itself against those seeking its destruction. And furthermore, the widespread protests that we see around the world, the wave of rampant anti-Semitism and the rising threats of violence against Jews, violence and threats of violence against Jews, clearly expose the link between the denial of Israel's right to exist and the denial of the Jewish people's rights to exist. And this is the rhetoric of genocide. Okay, so we are the victims here of an attempted genocide. Now, Israel was compelled after these vicious attacks by Hamas and its allies, was compelled to defend itself by removing the threat of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Without removing this threat, Israel cannot gain its security. We have 120,000 Israelis displaced that cannot go home to the areas near the Gaza Strip in the southern part of Israel. We have an additional 80,000, 100,000 Israelis displaced in the northern border of Israel with Lebanon because of fear of Hezbollah and because of the attacks by Hezbollah. So Israel is fighting here for its life. And the only way to regain our security is by eliminating the threat of the Hamas and eliminating its control of the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, the IDF operations in this densely populated Gaza Strip have led to a high number of Palestinian civilian casualties, indeed, although I don't know if it is as high as the Hamas official statements, because the statements coming out of Gaza Strip are by the health ministry of the Hamas. So the numbers are not unclear, but there are many civilian casualties and also considerable destruction. But we have to understand that these, while very unfortunate, are an inevitable consequence of the modus operandi of Hamas of enmeshing its military terror apparatus within the civilian environment. This includes launching and conducting military terror activities from within, around, and under residential buildings, schools, mosques, hospitals, and UN facilities. There's a whole underground Gaza of tunnels where the Hamas is operating from. Hamas uses civilians as human shields and views Palestinian civilian lives as a price worth paying to achieve its goal of the destruction of the state of Israel. It is actually their strategy. It's a win-win strategy, because either Israel refrains from an attack to spare civilian lives on the Palestinian side, or if it does attack, then this whole campaign portrays Israel as carrying out war crimes or even genocide. So it's a win-win strategy for the Hamas. Now, contrary to the picture portrayed by South Africa, in its application. And as explained by the excellent representatives of Israel in the hearing at the court, and I really recommend to anybody to hear the excellent representations made by the representatives of Israel. Israeli officials have declared time and time again that the military effort is directed against Hamas and not against the people of Gaza. I was in charge, I was the head of the International Law Department in the IDF. I was in charge of making sure that the orders, the military plans, the military orders, the targets, the targeting policies of the IDF abide by the rules of armed conflict. And the first and foremost one of them is that you direct your attacks at military objectives and not at civilians. So this is what we are taught. This is part of the whole rationale of the way that the IDF operates. And when you look at how the IDF is conducting its operations, you can see that it is giving advance warnings to civilians of impending airstrikes and other military operations. Also, it costs us with our military, making it more difficult for our forces because you're warning them in advance where are you going to operate. So the enemy can prepare, and still Israel gives these warnings, urges the evacuations of civilians from pending combat zones, works to facilitate the entry of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. And it requires really a totally twisting of fact and logic to read into these actions proof of genocidal intent on Israel's part, and that's what South Africa is claiming. And then South Africa relies on all kinds of quotes that it takes, sometimes out of context, sometimes quotes that were made immediately after the massacre of the 7th of October, and none of which constitute official Israeli government statements or policy, and tries to derive a genocidal intent out of these kinds of statements. What one must understand is that what South Africa is doing is to imputing to Israel an intention to harm the Palestinian people per se, and not what is really happening when Israel is going after the Hamas, is a baseless libel, I would say. And one must understand that this effort is an attempt, first of all, to focus the international discourse on Israel and away from Hamas heinous crimes. But more importantly, the idea and the purpose is to deprive Israel of its right to defend itself against those seeking its destruction. So this is what they are trying to do, and they are trying to make the words Israel and genocide go together and twist the way that Israel is perceived in the international community. All this in order, again, to deprive Israel of the possibility to defend itself and eventually to enable its enemies. So this is the link between this campaign on the ideological level, the political level, and with the military campaign, in order to enable our enemies, the enemies of Israel, to indeed seek the destruction of the state also physically.
Thank you, Pnina, for this in-depth analysis. I'd like to go to Emily now with a question about something that sort of accompanies, all that you have spoken about, Pnina, right? And that is an ongoing viral discourse and hateful discourse on social media, right? The levels of anti-Semitism and hate seen online after October the 7th were unprecedented. Emily, can you tell us what has been your experience in the last, 107 days, right? It's more than 3 months. And what's your take on that?
Sure. So I don't think it's a surprise to anyone listening that there's a problem on social media with anti-Semitism. What we have seen just in this last operation, and something that's been steadily building over time, is that with every operation or every incident that Israel faces, the rhetoric becomes more extreme. And part of the reason for that is because the social media platforms and legislators and individuals, of course, haven't been able to put a stop to this. They haven't enforced the policies that they already have in place. They haven't established policies that are stringent enough, that are targeted enough in order to direct and deal with and identify anti-Semitism. So there's a lot of blame to go around on that issue. But I think that what we're seeing now is an intentional misrepresentation of reality, and not just at the individual level of the Free Palestine crowd, although of course we see it from them too, but actually from state actors. And we know that Turkey and Iran, Russia and China have been sort of at the forefront of social media disinformation. And it's no different right now. Throughout the last year, and before that too, the Iranian regime has been extremely active in abusing social media in order to present certain viewpoints, in order to demonstrate that certain arguments are more popular or more prominent than others, when the reality on the ground, especially in the Western world, doesn't reflect that. And I'll give you an example just from this last this operation that we're in now. The polls, both in Europe and the United States, show that a majority of Americans, a pretty significant majority of Americans, generally support the state of Israel against Hamas. But if you look online, that's not the impression that you would get. You would think that there's tremendous anti-Israel sentiment, that everyone thinks Israel is a baby killer, war criminal, genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, take your buzzword. That is the impression that you get on social media. And another huge problem that we're dealing with is TikTok, which disproportionately impacts younger audiences. It's very popular with high school and with college, and it's growing in popularity in the West. And this is something that has influence, to put it lightly, from the Chinese Communist Party. It is something that they have been involved with monitoring and falsely elevating certain political lines of thinking and silencing other adverse arguments on political issues. Of course, issues that don't relate to us at all, such as China and Taiwan. We see that Taiwan is something that is sort of minimized on that platform, whereas if you have very pro-China policies, your videos have more organic engagement. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, anything related to us, it's much more difficult to get across a message that's pro-Israel on TikTok, and especially if you're living in the Western world, because the way their algorithm works is very closely tied to where you are geographically. You're going to get different content on the ground in China than you're going to get on the ground in the United States. And while I think it's concerning that there has been a trend, for example, of young Western teens who are suddenly supporters of Osama bin Laden, and there was this whole trend of reading Osama bin Laden's letter to America on TikTok, I don't think it's actually true that this was a trend. I think they framed it as if it's a trend and probably created, I don't even know if they're real videos these days. It's hard to tell because you can create pretty much anything with deep fakes if you want to push a certain talking point. But I think it's entirely possible that perhaps there were a few people who held this very ignorant view of Osama bin Laden, and then it was sort of spread all around as if it's a much bigger deal than it is. I think we see a lot of this on social media, things that might seem like they're very prominent and becoming very popular, both for good and for bad, when in reality, that's not quite the case. And you can see that through more traditional polling, as well as media, but more so polling across the Western world. So I think this is one of the most concerning trends that we've seen, because we're living in an era, especially when it comes to human rights, where we can no longer trust what we're seeing. And I was just expressing the other day to another, Israeli, that in a way, I'm saddened by the fact that I don't feel I can relate to what's happening to innocent people in Gaza who are, receiving the bad end of the stick, so to speak, of this conflict, despite having done nothing personally themselves, because I can't believe what's coming out. Because there has been so much dishonesty and so much lies about what's actually happening, about who these people really are, that we're not able to even feel empathy towards people who maybe really are innocent. We just don't know. And I think that this is a really scary thing, to live in an era where the information we receive, the images that we're seeing, are things that are difficult to trust. And this is in no way excusing the discrimination that victims of October 7th have faced, because I think it's absolutely inexcusable. Also because the perpetrators of these attacks themselves are the ones who filmed it, in some cases live streaming. But that being said, it is there is a certain element that is a byproduct of being in this era of disinformation. And it's very easy for people to dismiss things they don't like as being a conspiracy or as being manufactured, despite the fact that it might actually be real. And so we're in a difficult place when it comes to convincing people, because there's always a way around it. Truth is relative now, and that is a byproduct of social media. And it's exceptionally dangerous when it comes to political conflicts or ethnic or religious conflicts. And of course, war. War is perhaps one of the worst ways that we've seen this. We saw it with Ukraine and Russia. We're still seeing it. I mean, Russia's the king of online disinformation. They're known for it, whether it's election interference or what's happening on the ground with Ukraine. And that's very, very dangerous. And I think that Western governments need to do a much better job at policing and enforcing and working in conjunction with, and if they won't work with, then forcing social media companies and internet companies, and also AI technology as it continues to develop, to be transparent on these issues. And we're always going to have people who won't believe evidence no matter how clear it is right in front of them. But that doesn't mean that we need to contribute to making it more murky and more unbelievable what's actually happening. And I think that this is one of the reasons that when it comes to October 7th, it is so important that we have these firsthand testimonies. And I want to thank both of the speakers who spoke earlier. Olga started by saying it's very difficult to speak after that, and I agree completely. I was almost in tears just listening to what you guys went through. I'm so sorry, and we all stand with you in solidarity. And you're right, we've all been affected by this. But we need those stories. We need people to hear these messages, because there's nothing more powerful than someone who was an eyewitness themselves, someone who was a survivor themselves, who can speak about what these issues are in this era of disinformation. It's the only way that we can push back.
Emily, thank you. I think you used the key word to me, the relativization, right? Sort of, and that is a byproduct of social media, but we see it across the board. Everything is being relativized, right? And customized or personalized, sort of, I feel, thus this is my truth. And, that truth stands versus your truth. There's nothing objective. And I think it's one of probably, to my mind, one of the most dangerous features of our times. And we see it everywhere, right? Because everything is being interpreted in a certain way, and then nurtured within a certain echo chamber, sort of. And as long as you stay within your echo chamber, that's your truth. So, and social media just comes and amplifies it manifold, and makes it accessible also to people who are not experts necessarily in each of these areas, but they believe that after seeing a few posts or threads, they are. And that's what's so dangerous. I want to dive in a little bit now and go to Dr. Mark and dive in on one of the, as I said in my opening remarks, one of the, to me, the most horrific crimes of October the 7th, which is the rape of men and women, or women and men, should I say, and the horrific gender crimes that proof of it keep coming out. We didn't know at first how horrific it was, and now, and with each day, each week, there's more and more evidence that is, well, frankly, just impossible to stomach, right? And what happened, and one of the most obvious wrongs, so to speak, right, after the October the 7th, has been an almost absolute inability of women organizations to both condemn the horrific gender crimes, but also to be the advocates, right? To advocate for these women, survivors or victims of the horrific crimes. How do you explain this? In your opinion, does this impact the credibility of so many women organizations in the aftermath of the Me Too campaign, right? Including the UN agencies and the UN Women organization?
Well, Olga, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. And Ilan and Galit, thank you for the courage to share your stories. I know all of our hearts are broken, and just know that we stand with you. And I hope that helps with healing. I think, Olga, I know our time is short, and my answer to your question is yes, it does impact their credibility. And let's take a little bit of a deeper dive to understand this. After October 7th, I wrote a column for The Hill talking about the silence shattering my world. I was absolutely appalled that many of the women's organizations that I have worked with for decades were nowhere to be found. Many had come with me to Israel in the 1990s after the Oslo Accords were signed. We had a US-Israel binational meeting. They have worked with me and other organizations, especially Jewish organizations, to support the rights of women. And yet there was no condemnation. There was no support. There was nothing that came. And I tried to understand why. I think by taking an understanding of what happened helps to perhaps correct it, course correct it. And I came up with a couple of potential reasons. One, certainly anti-Semitism. We know anti-Semitism has been with us from the beginning of our time, from our genesis, and now it was just unearthed. It was socially acceptable, as we just heard, how social media has proliferated that. Was it due to lack of empathy, actually apathy, in the sense that if it didn't impact their groups, there really was no need to be concerned? The third is ignorance. We've heard a lot today about misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. Do they actually believe it? A fourth is the issue of moral equivalency, in the sense that what has happened with Palestinians, with Gazans, really negates what happened on October 7th, that if you show any empathy, then it shows that you are not connecting. Another issue may be cognitive dissonance. Some may not accept or agree with what the Israeli government has been doing, and Netanyahu's government. So if they do say anything, it basically condones. And then another, I think, which is extremely important, and we've seen that throughout the beginning of time, is fear. The fear to speak up because you might be next. I'm reminded of Secretary Lloyd's comments. So he's our defense secretary in the United States, Secretary Lloyd Austin's comments, that there is no room here for neutrality. It is really a battle between good and evil. And we know in the silence, evil grows, it thrives. In a sense, the silence is the fertilizer for this. So we have seen that in the silence, we have heard more about the propaganda and we haven't heard the stories. I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. My father survived 4 concentration camps. And throughout our life with him, he passed away in 2016. He always shared that his neighbors were nowhere to be found. They were silent when his family was sent to the concentration camps. And he was one of the last groups to go. He was from Romania, which at the time was Hungary. And so when it came time for his neighbors, there was no one there for them, because they stayed silent. I think, Maya Angelou once said that if someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And I think that's what we're seeing with some of these women's groups. What we have seen is that through Jewish organizations and others, there have been writing campaigns, there have been petitions to, for example, mobilize the United Nations. Finally, a representative will be heading over to Israel to investigate what happened, to explore what was behind this. But I think for all of us in our community, it's a little late, it's too little, and now we know what we are up against. But with that said, I don't want us to stop speaking. I think there is a lot of discussion about hearing more and more stories. I know it is extraordinarily difficult and horribly painful, just as it was when we learned about what happened during the Holocaust, what happened in these concentration camps. I think we need to share these stories. We need to be right in people's faces. And we need to bring people who have not conventionally been our partners to stand up with us. And that means we go beyond these women's groups, we go beyond the traditional players, because what we're talking about right now is human rights issues. It impacts one individual, it impacts all of us. And I hope that we will fight, we will stand strong, and we will speak out.
Thank you. That's a hopeful message towards the end, and I appreciate it a lot. Danny, to you now, and we just zoomed in, right, looking into one particular human rights area. But what I'd like to ask you is, to do the reverse exercise, sort of, and to zoom out. I mean, you worked for many years for one of the most prominent human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch. But I'd like to ask you to zoom out even more and to look at the entire human rights community, or human rights space. We've seen many of the human rights voices or NGOs, organizations, relativize the atrocity that happened on October the 7th, and some even denied that the massacre happened, including the rape and the gender violence. Can you give us your take on this, your analysis of how we reached this point? How can we even explain this?
Well, thanks for having me. I think there are a few reasons. One of them is this is the product of years of ideological creep, essentially, by which certain frameworks and concepts over the years have now taken hold so deeply they have become the norm. And they include, but are not limited to, Israel's occupation, Israel is an apartheid state, Israel is a colonizer. And it's not only the application of these terms, but it's the disproportionate application of these terms to Israel relative to other countries that could also be called colonizers: Australia, America, Canada. I mean, they're all candidates to be considered in the same group. And so when it came to October the 7th, this had normalized. It had so planted itself in the psychology of human rights groups and in the public mind that it resonated, and it didn't seem extraordinary to contextualize what had happened with these root causes frameworks that are so applied. And the risk of those frameworks, of course, is that they always allow for the very insidious word "but" to be added to anything that happens to Israel. So massacre of people at a musical festival, but the occupation, apartheid, and so on. So I think that's one reason. I think a second reason is that over the years in human rights organizations, there have been selective historical context applied. And of course, any context historical framework is subjective. And in the human rights world, it primarily begins in 1967, with Israel's occupation of the West Bank, and then it sort of skips to Gaza closure after 2005. And they are valid points along the way. But what they don't do is acknowledge other historical points of reference that are also relevant and important in Israel, the Israeli psychology and in Israeli thinking, which include 1948, Arab-Israeli wars, failed peace initiatives, and so on. So again, by the time it got to October the 7th, institutionally and externally, people were sort of primed for the way in which it was framed. Third, I think there are very particular aspects of internal culture within human rights organizations. One, and this is not exclusive to human rights organizations, is the impact of DEI over the years. Like many institutions and sort of bodies, DEI initiatives have really taken hold in recent years. And they are, of course, not a problem. They are positive in and of themselves: diversity, inclusion, and so on. But as we've seen in academia, the problem is not really in their formulation, but in their application. So it's all very well to accommodate different population groups with their own historical, religious, political backgrounds and sympathies. It simply has to be done in a way that also accommodates and doesn't take the oxygen out of the room of other people and other ethnic groups. And so I don't know if that has really been addressed or dealt with effectively. Another aspect of internal culture that's very specific to human rights groups and is really how they've got to this place is that, of course, by virtue of the fact you work in them, you're probably liberal leaning. So you're open to criticism of Israel. you're open to analysis. You may not even sympathize with various things that they're doing. You probably don't on a sort of policy level. And so there's a sort of slight frog in boiling water effect in being these organizations, you know, that you see is like, well, yeah, that you know, of course I believe in criticizing Israel. Of course I believe in you know, there are problems with the occupation. And then it just starts to feel off, because I think essentially it gives cover to real anti-Semitism. And people in human rights organizations have a real problem calling out anti-Semitism, because we've all been conditioned so much, rightfully in many cases, to say criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, except sometimes it is. And so it's a very particular focus of rights organizations, this Israel thing, that I think allows anti-Semitism to sort of lurk. And I think how we also got here is because human rights organizations have not always lived by their own policies. You know, there's an absolute failure to always apply their own standards to themselves. 3 more quick points. I think another reason we've got here is because of a very conscious policy in many rights groups called narrative change. Narrative change is the idea, and this was mentioned earlier, that you don't necessarily buy into the traditional power structures. You assert the narrative, you form new allies, and you set the agenda. And so in the case of Israel, this narrative change has been the apartheid framework. And this is a conscious effort by human rights organizations to assert this on the public stage. And that's why you hear it so often. And it has become normalized over the years. And so when October the 7th happened, it was sort of ready to go. It was on the lips. It was on the talking points. Another final reason, I think we've got here because human rights organizations are accountable to no one. They are self-regulating, self-appointed watchdogs of society. They are not transparent financially, and they are not transparent according to their operations. And you know, the problems with this have leaked out over the years with various scandals and problems. And each time, I think the strategy has generally been of human rights organizations to isolate them as individual flares or individual problems, rather than connecting the dots and saying maybe there's something fundamentally wrong going on here. And so all of those things, the ideologies, the narratives, the internal culture, the narrative change, and the lack of accountability, I think have contributed to where we are today.
Dani, thank you for your analysis. You gave us a lot of food for thought. And in a way, you sort of connected all the dots that all the panelists pointed. We almost have a map of different policy areas, and you in a way you gave it you used the very you used some key points. You used the words disproportionate. So first of all, sometimes, you know, the criticism to Israel is legitimate, but does it always have to be voiced, and does it always have to be put to the forefront? And instead of criticizing any other country, so disproportionate or judging Israel by double standards that would not be applied to other states or other conflicts, rather, or other ethnic or religious groups. It is always sort of contextualizing, and this connects to much of what Emily was talking about, which is relativizing everything. You know, yes, October 7th happened and there were grave human rights violations, but you use the word but, and there's always that contextualizing, right? That happens a lot in social media. And then you spoke at length, and this connects to everything that Pnina was talking about, and that is the institutional bias that has been happening over years. Because it would be one thing if we only spoke about the social media space, right? Where propaganda, misinformation, business interests thrive, right? State interests, China, Russia, Iran, and so on. It would be a different thing. It would be if it would be only in the legal sphere. But we sort of see it across the board. It starts with the United Nations, the UN Human Rights Council, and many other entities. The whole apartheid campaign started with creating the UN Commission of Inquiry, right, that investigates whether Israel is systematically violating international law. Now, it's interesting to mention that the Commission of Inquiry is a tool that UN regularly applies, but the one on Israel is one of the two that are permanent one, because typically Commission of Inquiries are created, they investigate a conflict or an issue, and once the report is done, they stop to exist. Now, that inquiry and the findings of the Commission of Inquiry were there to sort of create a legal precedent for the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And what happened in the International Court of Justice only last week, right, with the genocide accusation, is sort of the next level, because if the institutional accusation was first that Israel is an apartheid, now we see the accusation that it's a genocide, and it's being framed and contextualized in these decades of institutional bias against Israel. And as Dani said, not all criticism is anti-Semitism, but we sort of reached a point where within the human rights community, we never speak about anti-Semitism, even when it's so blatant that it should not warrant a discussion, that it's so obvious. I was at a concert last week, and of Idan Reicher, an Israeli artist who has been very, very active in playing for the families of the hostages and the soldiers and so on since October the 7th. And he, apart from giving us an extremely emotional performance, he used a term, and I cannot wash it off. He stood up, and in a packed room, he said, "We are the first generation survivors." And I know that it gives me goosebumps even now, because for anyone, born after the Holocaust, it brings a whole different connotation, right? I refer to myself as the third generation of Holocaust survivors, right? And then we spent years debating how each generation processes differently and places it within their identity. And to now refer to ourselves as the first generation survivors is horrific. But as horrific as it is true. And I think that that it also means that we need to address the bias and the discrimination that we see across the policy areas, just like they did. We need to call it out for what it is. We need to fight it, but we also must not lose our humanity. Emily also spoke about the fact that it is very difficult for us to identify with the suffering of the civilians in Gaza. And I've been interviewing myself a lot since October the 7th. And the second question after how many rockets and how many air raids was, well, what do the Israelis think of the suffering in Gaza? And I think one of the biggest challenges for us will be to continue to fight for our rights, to continue to fight for the place that Jews, the Jewish community, and Israelis of all religious and ethnic, whichever religious or ethnic community they believe to deserve within the human rights space, but to not do that on the expense of anyone else, and to acknowledge that there is suffering on all sides. And I think in that sense, we have to make sure that we are not only victims, and we don't see ourselves only as survivors, but we also learn something from our from the Holocaust survivors who also fought for humanity. In many ways, the challenge, although the numbers are not the same, right? But I think in terms of the feeling, after October the 7th, many of us felt the same. There was no way of knowing what will be the ultimate outcome, right, after October the 7th, but the feeling of being abandoned, of being completely failed by those who we, as members of the Jewish community, you know, the human rights community is the closest to us. Our religion teaches us justice and fighting for justice. And I think that will be part of the challenge of fighting for our right, but not losing sight that it is part of the bigger fight. And it is not an easy challenge, but I believe that if we continue to understand the issues the way that we understand them here in this panel, with each one of you being an unbelievable expert in his respective area, and Alon, you are the only man here. But I think that gives me hope, and I want to thank you on that note for taking the time to join us today. Galit and Alon, we really salute you for your bravery. We stand with you, and I want to believe that all of us here, I want to believe that you know that all of us here, day in, day out, fight ultimately for one thing, and that is to make sure that Tiferet didn't die in vain. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who joined us today. This was not an easy topic, but it is an important one, and it is an important one to understand as we look ahead. Someone wise said to me a few days ago, it will probably get much worse before it gets better, but it will get better, and it will get better because we are taking that on ourselves. Thank you so much.